Hello, everyone. If you're comfortable, you can turn on your cameras. If not, I totally understand. My name is Aubrey Yarbrough, and I am here to welcome you to a hometown diplomat, a conversation with Barbara Bartsch-Allen, presented with the Tower Center and the Hagee Career Development Center. I'm a junior at SMU, majoring in international studies and languages, and I'm a Vaughan Fellow at the Tower Center. And this summer, I'll be interning with the U.S. Embassy in Rome. So, just a quick outline of today's event. During today's event, Ms. Bartsch-Allen will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will open to questions from the audience. After that, I'll ask a few questions to get us started, and then I will open up to you all to ask any questions you might have. So please use the raise hand feature if you do have questions, so that I can know the order and put your hand down when you've asked your question. Please remain on mute until you're called on so that we can minimize the background noise. I'm going to give a quick introduction for Ms. Bartsch-Allen, and then I will hand it over to her. Barbara Bartsch-Allen is a Deputy Consular Chief and Chief of the American Citizen Services Unit. A native of Dallas, Texas, Barbara received her bachelor's degree from Southern Methodist University. She also has a Master of Public Administration from the University of Houston and a Master of Science in National Resource Strategy from the National Defense University. Barbara joined the Department of State in 2002 and has previously served in Indonesia, Guinea, the Operations Center, France, Afghanistan, Russia, and Cambodia. Prior to the Foreign Service, Barbara worked at the Center for Conflict Management at the University of Maryland. Barbara and her husband, also Foreign Service officer, enjoy exploring Bangkok and traveling in the region. And I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm very excited to be here today. I really am truly a hometown diplomat. I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas, and went to SMU. My parents taught at SMU at the time, so I really didn't get a choice of where I went, but it turned out to be a good deal for me. And I'm happy to get to talk to people in Dallas, especially since I feel like sometimes the East Coast where I live now when I'm in the States gets a lot of opportunities for international type engagement, whereas sometimes in places like Dallas, we don't, unless we seek them out ourselves, we don't really get those. So I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to start off by just telling you all a little bit about myself. I may not even take up the full 15 minutes. So I want to give everybody enough chance to ask questions. But I'll start off telling you a little bit about myself, where my background is, how I got involved in the Foreign Service, and a little bit about the Foreign Service exam, but I know there'll be lots of questions for that kind of thing. So as I mentioned, I was born in Dallas, Texas. I went to high school in Dallas and SMU, and I majored in African-American studies, history, and political science, and had a minor in Asian studies while I was there. So I've always had some sort of an interest in international affairs or international things. I really never knew what I wanted to do with that. I having grown up in Dallas, I couldn't wait to get out of Dallas because I wanted to explore the world. So my whole goal after Dallas was to get, after SMU, was to get to Washington, D.C. and try to see what there was out there in the world. And honestly, at the time when I graduated from SMU, you all are much further ahead than I was. I had no idea what the Foreign Service was. I'd never really even heard of it. So as far as my background, my parents worked there at SMU. I come from a pretty normal middle-class background. When I graduated from college, I spent about 9 years kind of putzing around. As I say, I have a problem with being bored easily, so I changed jobs. I tried various things. I worked at Middle East think tanks. I worked at a women's clinic for a few years. I worked at an internships in DC, where I found out about the Foreign Service from a previous ambassador. I then I moved back to Texas to go to graduate school at the University of Houston. I decided I wanted to get a public, after having been in DC doing internships for a while, I decided if I was going to be able to move forward in any organization, I needed some sort of a master's degree. I wouldn't say that's true now, but that's what was in my head at the time. So I worked in public works departments around the Houston area. So I managed asphalt contracts and things like that. Kind of strayed away from the international affairs kind of thing, worked at a design firm. And then I decided to get serious and start taking the Foreign Service exam. And to be completely honest, I took the Foreign Service exam 2 times. I didn't pass it the first time, passed it the second time. That's quite typical. That's not unusual. The format's changed a lot since I took it, but even then it's an oddly formatted test. And so it's not going to be like any other test anybody's ever taken. So it's not unusual not to excuse myself for not passing it the first time, but I didn't. Since I joined, though, it's the perfect career for me. I really wanted to see the world, and for me, the Foreign Service does that. I also happen to be fairly patriotic, so it was a good way to serve my country and get to see the world at the same time. So, as mentioned, I served in Jakarta, Indonesia for my first tour. While I was there, I call it a drive-by tour because normally in the Foreign Service, your tours last between 2 and 3 years. My tour in Indonesia only lasted 10 months because my second month there, the Bali bombing happened and the embassy drew down. And I was one of the essential staff that had to stay behind, but eventually I was forced to leave the country as well. So that was an introduction. And if you can stay through, if your first tour involves a bombing and you still love the life, it's a pretty good indicator that it's the career for you. The State Department then taught me French, and I went to Conakry, Guinea on the west coast of Africa, which was great for me as having been an African studies major. That was an interesting part of the world to get to see. I've not gotten to go back to Africa. After that, I worked in the State Department Operations Center, which is basically the 24-hour kind of hub. It's like it's the State Department's equivalent of the Situation Room in the White House. In fact, we work very closely with the Situation Room in the White House. So the Operations Center was a fascinating place to be. You get to see, it's 24 hours, we work shift work, and you do, it's fairly earlier in your career, so you get to see how the big power players really in the State Department work and what topics are important to them, what topics are really meaty at the time. So it was a great place to be. Made some of my career-long friends I've gotten from that situation, mostly because we were trapped in a room together for hours at a time, watching the world happen, literally. Then I got the opportunity to go to Marseille, France. And so because I spoke French already from my tour in Guinea, I got to go to Marseille, which I loved, as one would. I love Marseille, France. And after that, I went to Afghanistan, where I met my husband. I served, initially I was embedded with the military in Nuristan, which is in the northeast part of Afghanistan. And my job there was honestly to help the local Afghans access their government, since the government was new, learning working with the local government, the local officials there to be able to put their thoughts together of resources that they needed and get it to Kabul and figure out how that works. And that was part of our mission, was to help them. Unfortunately, it was not the safest environment at that time. And so I was moved down to Kabul, where I was the human rights officer for the rest of my tour. My tour there was a little over a year. And I did things like write the human rights report that the State Department puts out. I worked on the religious freedom report that the State Department puts out, and the trafficking in persons report. After that, I went to Moscow, Russia, where I worked in the consular section again. I'll kind of interject here, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit later. I am a consular officer. That doesn't mean I only do consular tours. In the State Department, it's pretty flexible about moving in and out of tours. So I have done throughout my career every other tour consular. Some people spend their whole lives in whatever cone they're in, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. After Moscow, we went to Phnom Penh, Cambodia. A fantastic place, one of my favorite tours, and just an amazing place in general. Angkor Wat's it's the largest religious site in the world. The whole history of Cambodia is fascinating and sad in many ways, but it's a wonderful place to be. And then I got the opportunity to study at the National Defense University with the military. And that's where and the State Department sends what averages out to one State Department person really per class. And we work with the military, and we study what sorts of resources the military might need in the future, and how the US government would acquire those resources. And that was a fascinating thing, to step out of State Department for a whole year and get to work again with the military and learn their lingo and they learn ours. And really, we teach each other about each other's organizations, because the US government, every agency and entity speaks completely different languages. And finally, I got to, for my last tour, well, the tour I'm in here right now, it's not my, hopefully not my last tour, is Bangkok, Thailand, which is kind of a dream tour for many people. And it's a great tour. My husband and I love exploring around Bangkok. In all of those tours, the State Department has taught me French, Russian, Dari, Khmer, which is the language in Cambodia, and Thai. That does not mean I speak all those languages anymore. If you stop speaking them, I lose them fast. I'm not as good about holding on to languages as some of my colleagues are, who I'm very jealous of. So I'm gonna right now kind of switch past what I've done to a little bit more general about the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service is basically divided into specialists and generalists. I'm a generalist. I'll talk briefly about what specialists are. Specialists tend to have special skills, as their name suggests, computer skills. They might have management type skills. There's security skills in that. There is facilities type skills. So, and we all travel together. We're all Foreign Service officers. Foreign Service specialists have a degree in whatever they're doing in the embassy. The generalists, we tend to come in from all different spectrums. In my entry class, there was a guy who quit bartending to become a Foreign Service officer. I had quit work. I happened to have been working at the University of Maryland right before that. There was a guy who quit who was a bluegrass band, and he joined. So the Foreign Service is aims to have a makeup of all different kinds of people from all socioeconomic backgrounds, to really have a good representation of what America is and looks like. And we honestly succeed in that to one degree or another, but we also don't succeed in one degree or another. So as a generalist, I had to take the Foreign Service exam to enter the Foreign Service, and that is administered, I think, twice a year now, maybe just once a year. And if you pass the Foreign Service exam, it doesn't mean you're automatically in. It's just the first step. It's one of several steps at that point, but it's 80% of the way. After that, you're going to go through security checks, as you might imagine, medical checks, as you might imagine. So, and then you get put on a waiting list, and you're put on that waiting list according to your score. So then you might, if you're at the bottom, you might ever come off the waiting list to go into an entry-level class. But that's basically, I'm really boiling that down. And when you enter the Foreign Service, generalists are divided into 5 cones. There's a public diplomacy cone, and these are people who specialize in public messaging to the host country, cultural events. They handle press in Washington D.C. in the department. They handle press, and the spokesperson was technically in that head of that cone, works in that cone. There's a political cone, which in countries overseas and back in the department monitor internal affairs and the internal political affairs in whatever country they're posted in, and external, so how that country might speak to another, or how that country handles other countries in the region or outside the region. So and then there's an economic cone, and economic officers monitor the economic environment of the country they're located in, but they also promote U.S. economic interests in that country. So attracting business, especially if there's not a commercial foreign service officer from the commercial foreign service. There's 2 foreign services, well, at least 2. So, that's what an economic officer would do. Management officers is the 4th cone. They negotiate contracts for the embassy and on behalf of the State Department in general. They run the embassy, and they tend to be in charge of morale. They're not officially in charge of morale, but the management officers play a vital role in the embassy as far as making sure that everything runs as it should in an embassy, and that everybody has the resources that they need to do the work of diplomacy. And finally, I'm a consular officer, and consular officers, the #1 goal and responsibility of the Department of State is to protect U.S. citizens overseas. And that's one of the things we do. Consular office, I happen to be in charge of one of those units at the embassy in Bangkok right now. We also issue visas, immigrant and non-immigrant visas, to people. We follow up on fraud in visas, or in American Citizen Services, passport fraud, and that kind of thing. So, but like I said, you can move in and out of those cones fairly easily to some degree or another. You get promoted according to what cone you're in, but there's a fair amount of leeway, and I've done okay. As far as being promoted. There's a fair amount of leeway. So it's not a job where you might get bored after 20 years of doing nothing but consular tours, for instance, which some people never do. I like to move around. I feel like it gives me a broader spectrum of what's going on in the embassy and in the foreign service. So foreign service officers, for those of you who don't know, they primarily spend their time at embassies or consulates overseas, and or back at the Department of State. Primarily, we have passport offices in Vermont, for instance, and there's a few other places where we have work, especially DS agents, which are diplomatic security agents, and they serve all over the United States, investigating passport fraud, visa fraud. They're police officers and agents who are in charge of protecting us in the embassy, but also in protecting the US public from any sort of fraud that might come about from visas or passport related fraud. I should say right now that there are a lot of non-foreign service career opportunities at the Department of State in Washington, D.C. Specialists, a good friend of mine was a specialist on Canada. So he worked at the Canada desk, and he advised the embassy in Canada and the consulates about goings on in Canada and what was happening there, what kinds of issues we might want to take up in Washington. And so there's those kinds of things. There's a lot of opportunities in the State Department in all those cones, but also outside them, back in DC. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll start opening it up for questions and see what people have for me. Happy to answer them.
Thank you for talking to us today about a career with the State Department. So let me start us off with a few questions I was thinking about when you were speaking. So just generally, what has been your favorite place to serve and why?
I knew that question was going to come, and that's a hard question for any foreign service officer. We ask each other that question all the time. It's always the post you're in. So I have to say, during COVID, Thailand has not been hit hard at all by COVID. So we and a lot of that has to do with the government came in and enforced mask wearing right off the bat, and everybody complied. And as foreigners, we complied. It's not our country, so we try to respect the laws and regulations that are taking place. So sorry if you can hear my cat screaming. She's mad I'm not letting her in this room. But so it's always the post you're in. However, I will say it's hard not to have loved Marseille, France. That was a wonderful tour to go on. I was trying to go to Pakistan when I got the call. Normally we bid on the positions we go to. I did not bid on Marseille. I was trying, like I say, to go to Pakistan, but they had an opening. They needed a French speaker, and they happened to know I had not accepted a job yet anywhere. So I got a call and asked to go to Marseille. So it was a lucky break for me, I would say. But there's something to love about each of the countries I've been in. I've learned something every place I've been. It was fascinating to be in Africa, and having had a major in African studies, African American studies, and to get to see that part of the world. Moscow was interesting because I've served in Muslim countries. I've served in countries where I don't look like the population. Moscow was the hardest place I've ever been to fit in with the culture. So it was fascinating I looked like everybody walking down the street, but I didn't fit in with the culture. It was not in a bad way. It was much more of a culture shock for me than I've ever had. And it was fairly far into my career. I found it to be a fascinating tour though, and I wouldn't say that I wouldn't go back there, but it was an adjustment to get to serve there, and maybe it's the cold. I'm from Texas. I didn't really like the cold so much. So.
Okay. Thank you for that. And another question I have, which is probably not on a lot of people's minds, but I think it's definitely a good one to ask and keep in mind when thinking about joining the Foreign Service. How is it managing a family, traveling together, meeting somebody in the Foreign Service, or having somebody who's, not in the Foreign Service with you? So.
Okay, so my husband and I happen to not have children, but we are the minority in the Foreign Service. There are many people with children that join the Foreign Service or have children while they're in the Foreign Service. And schools are in general pretty good. I listen to them talk about finding good schools and going to places. There's international schools. I personally am super jealous of these. We call them Foreign Service kids. I'm super jealous of these Foreign Service kids. They've gotten to travel around every 2 to 3 years. They get to exposure to other cultures, other languages early in their life. So they go to schools with kids from all over. We're not the only Foreign Service in the world. Almost every country has one, and so they get to be part of a community of kids that do this all the time, and they keep up with these kids. And I've had friends with kids who are now adults and just have a fascinating perspective on life. Being a tandem couple is a little more challenging. The Foreign Service tries its best to put couples together who are both Foreign Service officers, or if maybe one works for the Foreign Commercial Service or somebody works for USAID, they really try to work that together and put them in the same embassy. That doesn't always work out, and there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. So for instance, right now I supervise somebody who serves here in a tour, and her husband's serving in Malaysia. If they can't get you together, they will try to get you in countries that are very close to each other. So that happens. Now, I've been single in the Foreign Service, and I've been married in the Foreign Service. I didn't have a problem with being single in the Foreign Service. And most people don't, I don't think. You get to take advantage of lots of things that others don't get to take advantage of, that married couples. And I'll stay right here. I came into the Foreign Service married. I was divorced, and then I was single, and then I remarried. So I've experienced kind of both. And I remember speaking to after I had gotten divorced, I was speaking to some of the people in my entry-level class, and they were talking about things they'd done when we all joined. And I'm like, but I didn't do that. And they said, we didn't invite the married people. And so you were married at the time. So there's little niche groups, people find support networks. And so if that means that the singles hang out together and support each other, they do that. And that happens at every post. It happens back in the department. So, or if the married couples or the people with children, as you might imagine, my husband and I don't spend a lot of time going to the park, but there are families that get together. So there is a concerted effort in the Foreign Service to try to make things as normal as they can, so that families can have a real relationship with other families and a family atmosphere.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And now I'm going to open it up to everyone else. If you want to raise your hand and ask a question, feel free, and I'll be on the lookout.
I'll talk a little bit while you're waiting for somebody to raise their hand about benefits in the Foreign Service. So one of the benefits is you get to learn language, and that's paid for by the US government. So that's always good. When we're overseas, we are generally put in housing. So there's a few posts in the world where you have to find your own housing, but we're generally living in government housing overseas. So that can be hard for some people. For me, I'm like, I get to live in Bangkok and someone's paying for my housing. That's great. But others, really that's an adjustment for them to not be able to choose where they're living. And you don't get to choose where you're living. It's based on your rank, where you're living, and what your job's going to be in the embassy. So I can talk more about that, but I thought that
no
might
worries.
be
We have tons of raised hands right now.
okay.
So first I want to call on Savni, if you want to go first and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us. This is super, super insightful. So I had a question about just like what you studied again when you were at SMU, and then when you worked with the Foreign Service, did you come across a lot of people that had a legal background? What is the situation on law school? Does that help with someone in the, I guess the management one, which is going to be like talking about contracts and things like that? Because I'm sure a lot of people here are also thinking about law school.
Okay. So again, I studied African American studies, political science, and history at SMU. Mostly, and I'm going to be really honest about this, my parents worked at SMU, so I got to go free to SMU, so which is was a big benefit for me, and I got to go free for 5 years. So I stayed in for 5 years and wound up with 3 majors. In the Foreign Service, there are a lot of ex-lawyers, a lot. I'm not one of them, but there are a bunch. And they don't always, strangely, they're not always in the management section. That's a good point. I could see that being, but the Consul General up in Chiang Mai right now, he's a close friend of mine from the Operations Center. He was a lawyer before he joined the Foreign Service. I think that especially people who, there's a lot of people. I didn't join the Foreign Service until I was 31 years old. So there's a lot of people who made the Foreign Service a second career. So I think that 10 years, as far as I know, and I don't know anything really about the law profession, but he and many of my friends worked really intense hours and then decided, hey, I think I might like to try something else. And I've always had an interest in international affairs, and this was a good fit for them. That doesn't mean that we don't work long, intense hours, because we do sometimes, but it was a second career for him. So, and for many of my lawyer friends. But I will say we have an entire legal team back in the State Department. So that's one of the jobs, I'll just add that real quick, that is with the State Department that is not usually thought of. We have specialists in immigration, specialists in passports, specialists in US citizenship, all kinds of things, and international parental child abduction. I'm talking mostly from consular point of view because that's my specialty, but we have specialists in all entire legal teams back in the State Department. So as you might imagine, the State Department needs that. So it's a good career path for just joining the State Department in general.
Okay, Max, you can ask your question.
Hi. To me, the Foreign Service doesn't strike me as an entry-level job. So, in your opinion, is there like an amount of years you would recommend spending in the workforce before we try to take the Foreign Service exam, or is it something we don't necessarily have to wait too long for, gain experience for?
So, Max, that's a good question. I mentioned that I didn't join until I was 31. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I didn't know about it until I was in my 20s, out of college. But we call entry-level classes A100 classes. In my A100 class, there were 97 of us. We ranged in age from 23, I think that was the youngest person, to 57. 57 is the oldest you can be and join the Foreign Service. That has to do with being able to get to vest in your retirement. But so we had the person who was 23 was right out of college, had not had a job before outside of whatever job she'd had in college and high school. So, and then I'd had about 9 years of experience, and there were people who had a whole military career before they join the Foreign Service, and everything in between. So it really doesn't matter if to retire from the Foreign Service and get full retirement benefits, you have to have 20 years or be 50 years old, whichever comes last. So some people, I feel like, kind of game it. Other people are like, well, I'm going to stay in for as long as I possibly can. We're forced to retire at 65 right now. So I don't think that it's just where you are in your life. Frankly, if I'd known about the Foreign Service beforehand, I would have taken the test earlier. If life hadn't kind of taken me in different directions, I probably would have taken the Foreign Service test earlier if I'd known how much I was going to enjoy the career.
Thank you.
But if you want to experience something else in your life, you've got plenty of time to do it. I think that I actually was going to mention that if there's something you're like, I really want to try my hand at graphic design for several years, that's fine. It does not keep you from the Foreign Service. No background or job you would have had before the Foreign Service is going to keep you out of the Foreign Service. I mean, unless it was a security job that it might cause you not to have a security clearance. But in general, they want all kinds of backgrounds. So
I will get to everyone else's questions in 1 second. I just thought of something while you're talking, which I've heard about, which I think is pretty important for everyone here who's interested in a career to know about. So what's the timeline of taking the Foreign Service exam? Because I believe you can only take it once every year, or there's some sort of time limit.
So you're kind of stepping out. When I took it, it was only offered once a year, but you could take it every year.
Okay.
So, and I think for a while they were offering it twice a year, but I don't know if they still required that you only take it once. You could only take it once every year. I don't know, but at least when I took it, you could only take it once a year because it was only offered once a year, but I took it 2 years in a row. So.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. I'm not sure what it is now, but I'll have to look at that.
And that would probably be on careers. You probably have the link to that, but I think it's www.state.gov/careers. And then it tells there's links to the Foreign Service, and you can tell about, you can read up on the rules and when the test might be being offered. And we offer it all over the world.
Thank you. So Keely, if you want to ask next.
So I kind of have two questions. What's the difference between sort of serving in like a really big embassy like Bangkok versus a really small like consular general section in like Chiang Mai? And then what are your best tips for studying for the Foreign Service exam?
Okay, so I've served in from a post that had 2 Foreign Service officers to Embassy Bangkok, which is the largest right now in the world. There's a big difference. So I'm fairly far in my career, and I'm pretty much as high as I can get without competing to enter the senior Foreign Service, which is a whole another thing y'all don't need to worry about. But so even at that level, I'm a deputy. So that it's a big section, it's a big embassy. I oversee about 50 people, and that's the people that that I supervise indirectly, some of them directly, some of them. So, but I'm a deputy. So I've been in medium-sized posts where I was less, I guess, advanced in my career, but it was in charge of an entire section. I went to what we call country team every week. Country team is where the ambassador meets with the heads of each section, and we brief him on all, or her on all the important aspects of what's going on in our sections. And then at Marseille, which is a consulate general in France, there was 2 of us, and I got a lot of responsibility there. So I went out and gave speeches in French. I gave speeches in English. I represented the US at the World War II memorial celebrations. We covered Monaco. So I got to go to Monaco and be near Prince Philip, so I got to do some pretty, what you think of as, I guess, the typical stereotype of what a Foreign Service officer does. Most of my career has not been that stereotype, but I would say all of them are fascinating. I would, if I had to be in one embassy or one consulate for the rest of my career, and I could only choose by size, I'd probably choose a medium-sized embassy, because medium-sized embassies, you still get a lot of responsibility, but there's a more camaraderie among people. People here in Bangkok. It's very hard to meet other people in this section because everybody's out having a good time. They meet friends on the economy. Same thing in Paris. All the biggest embassies, you have friends that are in the city, not so much in your workplace. So that's a big difference. I would say socially is the big difference. And then what was your second question? What to study? So that's a good question. I studied, so I didn't pass the first time. I didn't really study the first time. The second time I did study kind of. I honestly read a book called The People's History of the 20th Century. That's not what the book you should read. I'm not saying that everybody should read that book. The reason I read that book is because what the Foreign Service is testing is what you know about the U.S. What can you bring besides testing some of your, they ask some personal questions on the test of what foreign languages do you speak and things like that. But besides that kind of thing, they're really, at least from my perspective, and this is, I don't think I'll write this down anywhere, they're really looking at what do you know about America? How do you know, what parts of American history do you know that made America great? So on the test, a lot of it has to do with the 20th century. The 20th century is the century for the United States. So there were questions about jazz. I remember them asking me about explain the Blue Note, I guess, school in American jazz. And I was like, I don't know what that is. I know I missed that question, but jazz is important to American history. So they're asking all kinds of questions. So I really think, people say it's about, you should know about current affairs, and you should. I mean, you should read the paper and know what's on the front page of the Washington Post or the Washington Times or pick your paper. It doesn't need to be any political bent, but you should also, because that you're going to be around people who that's all they've done. I have friends that spent their entire lives reading The Economist just to prepare for the Foreign Service exam. I did not do that, but I did. I read that book. I seemed to do okay. I would say on the Foreign Service exam, this is, like I say, the format has changed since I took it almost 20 years ago, but I would say answer all the questions. Okay, for your best guess. People I know who have failed, including myself the first time, were like, well, I don't know the answer to that question, and I'm not going to answer it. Answer the questions, even if they're just asking personal questions, like name 5 foreign phrases that you know. Put down 5 foreign phrases. It doesn't have to be fancy phrases. So I think that it's really just it's a good practice test. It's a weird test, but it is really just trying to see what you know about the U.S. and not so much history, but the culturally and what's important to us. What landmark law cases were there? All these kinds of questions, things that you should have paid attention to in high school. Honestly, that's maybe you've forgotten. I certainly did, obviously, the first time around, but I refreshed and I was okay. Others?
Thank you. Izzy, you can go next.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us today.
No
my
problem.
questions, I have 2 questions sort of, but the first one is, after taking the Foreign Service exam, what was your entry into the Foreign Service like? And then my second question related is for some of the students that have an interest in joining the Foreign Service out of college, what advice would you offer for sort of next steps or preparing, not necessarily related to the Foreign Service exam, but in terms of just sort of academic paths or work study paths and things of that nature?
Okay, so when you take the Foreign Service exam, once you've passed the written part of it, and now there's an essay that, there was an essay when I took it too, but you took it at the time that you do the written. I think they've kind of divided it up, and now you pass one, then you move to one. It might be in 3 stages now. But you eventually are going to have an oral exam. You take an oral exam, and that's a harsh exam. People are like, to the right, you've passed, to the left, you have not passed. It's a really sort of a shocking exam, I would say, but they're really just, at that point, they're really just seeing, I think, and this is not what maybe is not what their goal is, but I think they're really just saying, how do you interact with people? Are you in a room working with people? Are you able to be diplomatic in a room, in a setting? So once you've passed that, then you have to go through a security background check, because Foreign Service officers do have TS clearance. We have to go through a medical exam to see if you are able to serve worldwide, because we do sign a agreement to serve worldwide. And then you get put on the list. And as I mentioned, you go on the list based on your score on the test and by your cone. You've chosen your cone by that point. And so for me, it was about a year between when I passed the test and getting off the list. So I'm having all the security background checks and everything done. They offered me a class, a Foreign Service entry-level class, and I took that offer. So that's how kind of the timeline for me. Some people have sat on the list for 3 years, some people for a couple of months. It just really depends on how many people are wanting to enter, how many Congress decides how much money we get, which determines how many people that can be hired. So there's a lot of politics happening in the background that I'm not involved in, but I would say if you're interested in joining the Foreign Service right outside of college, know a language, learn a language. Languages give you an up now, as I understand it. I could be wrong, but as I understand, they give you an up on the test. They can increase your points a little bit. So you can take a test, and if you pass Foreign Service, they might bump you up on the list. But in general, I would say that not just for the Foreign Service, knowing language just opens up so many paths for you. Knowing a second language, a third language, it teaches you how other people think, the way languages are formed, teaches you what people find important in their culture. It really gives you an appreciation. For those of you who know French, French is definitely the best of the languages I speak. I'm not great at French, but it was always shocking to me, and it luckily never happened to me, to see someone be corrected for using the impersonal in French. And I've seen this happen in front of me because someone has used the French term for you in the impersonal and been corrected and told they are not allowed to use that with a person. You must use the formal. So shocking, but formality is important in France. And so in some settings, not always, but so it just teaches you so much. All the languages that I've had a chance to learn have given me some sort of insight into that culture and opened a door that I wouldn't have had opened even outside the Foreign Service. They've opened doors outside the Foreign Service. As far as things to study, I would never presume to tell you what to study. You should study what you love, what interests you, and nothing is going to get you into the Foreign Service. And nothing's going to keep you out of the Foreign Service. There are theater majors in the Foreign Service. There are political science majors in the Foreign Service, music majors, math majors, anything. If you love it, you should do it. And then there will be a way to work it into your life in the Foreign Service at some point. You will be shocked what you will be able to work into the Foreign Service later in your career that you had an interest in. So I would say follow your heart. I know that sounds cheesy, but you should really do what you want to do. And if the Foreign Service doesn't happen for you, then it's another path you can take, and it's a path that you were interested in all along. So that's what I would say for that, for things to study. But you should know history to pass the test, or not history, but the U.S., what the U.S. makes up the U.S., makes the U.S. culture, what makes it. So.
Thank you. EJ?
Hello, thank you so much for your time today. I have a question about one of the careers you mentioned before going into the Foreign Service. You mentioned that you worked at a couple of, at some Middle East think tanks. which is fairly close to what I'm personally interested in doing. Could you maybe compare and contrast that career with the Foreign Service, and maybe explain why you favor the Foreign Service over that lifestyle?
Okay, so I will caveat this with it would be a stretch for me to say it was a career, but I was definitely an intern for a couple of years in the DC area, working at Middle East think tanks. I worked at the Middle East Report, which no longer exists, I don't think, and the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, and the Near East and Near East Affairs Bureau, and I worked for a NGO or a think tank at the University of Maryland called this Center for International Development and Conflict Management, which had a component that was heavily, I guess, geared towards the Middle East. And I will say I fell into that by accident. I had always been interested in international affairs. When I went to Washington to get internships, it was hard for me because a lot of jobs on the Hill require that you work there 60 hours a week for free. And I don't have a family that could have supported me in an apartment in DC for free. So I had to look for internships that would allow me to have a job during the day or at night. And I was lucky that the Middle East think tanks that I wound up with, and I was getting referred to one after the other, allowed me to do that. That said, I gained a lot of respect for the work that is being done there. And I found that while my interests, and I quickly realized this, my interest in international affairs were much more broad. I was much more interested in seeing the world and seeing what was out there. Other cultures were always fascinating to me. I was never wanting to drill down onto just one part of the world. So for me, staying in that environment probably wouldn't have been a good fit in the long run. But the people who work in, and I know I have stayed in touch with some of those people, including other interns who moved into that as a career, into think tanks and writing scholarly journals and the like. They're passionate about it, and they're doing really earth-moving, earth-shaking type work in that field, and really helping, helping understand those cultures, helping understand, peace processes that are happening. These are the experts that even the State Department calls on when we really need insight into that. So I really think if there's a culture that you want to drill down on, or a part of the world that you want to drill down on, the NGOs or the think tanks that work on those kinds of issues are by all means a wonderful way to follow a career and do something that is satisfying for you for a long time. And also you will probably wind up working with the State Department at some point, or be a consultant for us at some point, because we do value our collaboration with other organizations, and often host, even when we're overseas, we host roundtables for NGOs and all kinds of things. So those are really specialty experts, and it was not what I was. I would have been horrible at being a specialty expert, but I have a lot of respect for the people who are doing that. We have them in the Foreign Service too. I'm just not one of them.
Okay, so we're about done, but I want to get to Alexander's question. There's another one from Max after that, but we'll see how far we get.
No problem.
Sorry, I was just wondering, what's the biggest difference you've noticed between like hardship posts and more easy posts?
The superficial answer would be shopping, because it's really hard to go places, and their hardship posts are hardship for a reason. Though Conakry, Guinea was a hardship post, and easily one of my favorite posts. And I went and did things out I had friends on the economy, as I say, I had people who I went to their houses for dinner, and I enjoyed it. It was hardship because you just couldn't that place was hardship because you just didn't have access to some of the nice things in life, like electricity 24 hours a day or running water all the time. But if you were willing to work around that, and the lights going out in the middle of the night didn't bother you, or going out in the middle of the day, or having to throw away everything in your refrigerator once in a while because it had gone bad, that for me that was a minor inconvenience to being able to say that I lived and had a great, time in West Africa. Afghanistan's is different because it's like a hardship for danger and for it's hard to get the necessities. So in a danger environment, you're locked down a lot more. We don't have freedom of movement. There's no, to leave the compound, I had to get special permission every time I did it. There are people who never leave the compound. All visitors come into the compound. So freedom of movement can be restricted. And for some people, that's just not a way they want to, it's not a place they want to serve. It's not a place they want to live for a year or two. So they don't serve there. The easier posts are obviously, I mean, if you've traveled to any big city, the easier posts are just like living in any big city with a whole different culture and post on top of it. So I've served in them all. I love hardship posts. I think that they're called hardship posts. I mean, the people living there all the time, it's not a hardship post for them. Nobody's giving them extra money to live there. So I sometimes feel like it's sort of a misnomer to call it a hardship post, because there are people living their lives and doing just perfectly fine every day, who live in that environment or who live their lives there and maybe don't do just fine, but that's what we're there for, is to see how we can help and what we can do to represent the United States and be considered a resource for that country. So I think that it's really just a matter of freedom of movement and freedom of abilities to do things that you take for granted in the United States.
Thank you. Well, Max, if you wanted to get to your question really quickly, and then we're going to wrap up.
Just really quickly, I guess, so as a Foreign Service officer, are you subject to the same internet restrictions that a person in your host country would be if they were a citizen of that country?
Okay, so if we're at home, probably yes. So if for instance, right now, I think in Myanmar, they're cutting internet at a certain time every day. If you're working from home, you're probably not going to have internet during the day. But at the embassy, you likely will have access to internet if it's some sort of form. We are very careful about what we do at home, no matter what country we're in. We don't, one might guess that Russia was not a place where I did a lot of things that were personal on my computer at home. Whereas I feel a little bit better about that in a country like France, maybe, but I'm still very guarded about what I do as a government official. And to some degree, that's the same at work. There's, at work, well, you're allowed to check your Facebook page, for instance. You could do something like that. There's some websites maybe you can't go to at your work computer, so that maybe you would at home. I think if the country imposes things and like puts a blackout on internet, if you're subscribing to local internet at your house, you're going to be out of internet. But at work, you're probably going to have access to the outside world, at least as far as the internet's concerned. So good question.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for asking good questions, and thank you for the answers. And today has been such a pleasure, and we appreciate your insight on a career as a Foreign Service officer. Also, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's tuned in and listened to this riveting event. Just a reminder, this is the last Tower Center focused event of the semester, but we hope to see you all for more events in the fall. Thank you.